Hopefully you read the sample essay provided by one of my students. I would like to go over that essay and talk about what was good in it and what could have maybe used a little more improvement. I'll also tell you what grade I gave this essay. The first thing I want to talk about is how this author introduces herself. I've taken out her name, but she does give her name, and then she says, as a Pennsylvania resident, I am concerned. Obviously, this person doesn't have any personal experience with the death penalty, but she does want the reader to know that she is a resident of Pennsylvania, and as such, she does have a voice in decision making in the state. So that's a fine way for her to set up a connection and to state who she is in this paper. I'd also like to talk about her background. Her background comes at the end of the first paragraph, which is a little bit of a strange place for it, but she ends up working it in all right. She talks about the years and different things that have happened in those years, and she says we're nearing the end of 2008. There are 224 inmates awaiting execution. She talks about the first person to be killed by lethal injection in the state. That's a good length for a background section. You don't want it to be too long because you don't want to bore your reader with details. Remember, your audience will probably also know a fair amount about the issue depending on who you're writing to. She's writing to a politician, so this is going to work well because this politician probably already knows a lot about the death penalty, so she doesn't have to go into a ton of detail about the background here. That would just be redundant for them. I'd also like to point out her thesis. The thesis is not quite where it should be, and if there was anything I could change about this paper, I would move the thesis up to the first paragraph. Her thesis comes at the end of the second paragraph. She says, I believe that there would be a decrease in the amount of homicides if the death penalty was swift and consistent. She's stating what the topic is, it's very obvious which side she's on, and she's hinting at the solution. She thinks that it should be made more swift and should be used more consistently. The next part of her essay then goes on to the defense. Now, because she's been throwing some numbers out in the background here, she then uses an emotional appeal. She talks about 62-year-old grandmother Betty Lou Beets. This is a disturbing example that would get most people's emotions riled up. So by using this example, she's not only talking about abstract criminals, she's talking about one person in specific, which is very effective here. So that is an example, and that's a well-placed one. It is, however, also an extreme example, which is what makes it an emotional appeal. The case of Betty Beets is obviously not very common. She then goes on to talk about Texas, and she gives us a lot more statistics. So she's using statistical appeal here, where she talks about the number of people executed in Texas. She's using this as an example of what she thinks should be done, but she's also using just a lot of facts and solid figures. She also, if you notice at the end of that paragraph, uses a quote, a paraphrase from her research, arguments for and against capital punishment. So we know that she was looking at scholarly sources for this essay, which makes her sound more credible. She then goes on to give her solution here. She's saying that since capital punishment in her eyes does deter criminals, it should be used more frequently. And she's talking about how people can help expedite the executions in the state of Pennsylvania. So overall, this is a very well laid out paper. The pieces are all here. She does have a concession, she has a background, she has a thesis, and she has her defense and her solution. Obviously, this is significantly shorter than your paper is going to be because for this class they were to write a letter instead of a regular essay. But this is just a good example of how you can make a good persuasive argument even in a short amount of space, just because you have really good appeals and do a nice job of gaining the trust of the audience. This paper did receive an A. Despite the misplaced thesis, this is very, very well written. Her side is clear throughout, and she uses good persuasive wording and good persuasive techniques to make her point.